1949, and the Cold War is getting underway. Troops trained to defend Western Europe, and the United States joins its allies to set up NATO. In China, the communists achieve their greatest victory as Mao Zedong becomes ruler of a quarter of the world's population. British troops reinforce Hong Kong, and the frigate HMS Amethyst makes a daring escape from communist forces. In London, the year opens cold, and with the city still gripped by post-war austerity. Smog shrouds the streets, and although there is a hint of better things to come when clothes rationing is abolished, the country is stunned when the pound is devalued, sending basic food prices up. There is turmoil in the financial markets, and the government exhorts British firms to take advantage of devaluation by launching a massive export drive. One unlikely figure who listened to the government's exhortations was a 69-year-old widow, Olivia Durand Deacon. She had been left wealthy by her husband, who had been colonel of the Gloucestershire Regiment, and had been living comfortably at the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington's elegant Queensgate for many years. Mrs. Durand Deacon had had the idea to produce artificial fingernails from plastic and was looking for someone to help her exploit it. One of the hotel's other permanent guests seemed just the man, a dapper and friendly 39-year-old businessman named John Haigh. Always cheerful and well-dressed, Haigh drove a smart Alvis motorcar. He told people at the hotel that he was the owner of a prosperous small factory in Crawley, about 50 miles south of London. When Mrs. Durand Deacon approached John Haigh about her idea, he was extremely interested. He told the entrepreneurial widow that he would look into the type of material which would be needed for the fingernails and find out whether the necessary equipment could be accommodated at his factory. Haigh consulted his diary, and they agreed to go down there on the 18th of February to discuss the project. Haigh arranged to meet Mrs. Durand Deacon outside the Army and Navy department store and drive her down to Crawley in his Alvis, but he later claimed that she failed to turn up. Nevertheless, Haigh drove down to Crawley that day. He had been a regular visitor for several years and was known in the town. At about 4 o'clock, he was seen at the George Hotel in the centre of the town, having tea with a lady of a very similar appearance to Mrs. Durand Deacon. 2.5 hours later, he popped into a nearby cafe, the Old Ancient Priors, for an egg on toast and a chat with Mr. Outram, the proprietor. Later, at around 9:30 in the evening, he went back to the George for dinner. After enjoying a hearty meal, he drove back to London. The next morning, Mrs. Durand Deacon was not at her usual table for breakfast. Expressing surprise, John Haigh asked another guest, Mrs. Constance Lane, who was rather less enamoured with him than some, if she had seen Mrs. Durand Deacon. To his consternation, she knew all about their appointment, and he hastily explained that Mrs. Durand Deacon had failed to meet him as arranged. Later that day, Haigh drove back down to Crawley. While there, he visited his premises and sold some jewellery for £110. He also left a Persian lamb coat for cleaning and called in at the George for a meal. As usual, he was quite open about his presence in the town. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lane had checked her friend's room and found that it had not been slept in. When the next morning Haigh asked her if she had any news, she announced that she was going to the police. This took Haigh somewhat aback, but he recovered sufficiently to offer to drive her to the station in his Alvis. At first, the police didn't take the disappearance very seriously, but a sharp-eared agency reporter phoned the story to an evening paper, and soon it was being widely reported, and a search was mounted by Scotland Yard. Haigh's first interview seemed unsuspicious, as he explained that Mrs. Durand Deacon had failed to turn up at their rendezvous. Back at the hotel, he confirmed his story in a lengthy statement. But routinely following up his story of the trip to Crawley, police were surprised to discover that far from owning a factory down there, he only did some business there, and occasionally used a small storeroom. The police decided to question John Haigh again. He was interviewed a third time by a policewoman, Sergeant Alexandra Lambourne, who took an instant dislike to the little man. He seemed too eager to please. Nonetheless, he repeated his story without any apparent inconsistencies. Back at the station, she wrote a report saying that she felt uneasy about him, and suggesting that his background should be investigated. Haigh complained to the press about police harassment. However, it turned out that Sergeant Lambourne was right to be suspicious. He had a long record as an accomplished conman, and had in fact been in prison 3 times for fraud, forgery, theft, and false pretenses. With what appeared to be a promising lead, the local police at Crawley were asked to check Haigh's story again, and they went back to the head of the factory with which Haigh had done some business. It was then that he suggested that they might like to look in the storeroom that Haigh used. On the 26th of February, 2 detectives accompanied him to the small yard in which it stood. The yard still exists today, close to the centre of Crawley. The only set of keys had been lent to Haigh, so the detectives